Welcome to Bottom Up, a monthly podcast dedicated to issues and topics of interest to young lawyers in Wisconsin and beyond. I'm Emilio Villagale.
And I'm Kristen Hardy, and we're your hosts. This is the Bottom Up Podcast. Hello, and Happy New Year to all of our listeners. Happy 2024. This is one of your hosts, Kristen Hardy. I'm flying solo today without the lovely Emil. He is on son, husband, brother duty today, so he isn't here. But before we begin today's episode, I want to give a shout out to all of our loyal listeners. When Emil asked me to join this podcast as a guest host over a year ago, I was nervous because it's nerve-wracking to hear your own voice recorded. But I've really enjoyed the ride, and I look forward to more guests, more interesting topics, and more feedback from each one of you. So thank you. If you're a first-time listener, welcome. Again, I'm flying solo. But the good thing about flying solo today is that I'm excited to welcome a very special guest, Erika Petty, who's the lead attorney and executive director of an organization that is very near and dear to me, Lotus Legal Clinic, which is based here in Milwaukee. Welcome, Erika.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So one of the reasons I wanted Erika to visit us today is because it's Human Trafficking Awareness Month, and Erika is well-versed in the subject, given her work with Lotus. So for those who don't know, Human Trafficking Awareness Month is observed annually in January, and its purpose is to raise awareness about the global issue of human trafficking. So during this month, various organizations, activists, and communities often come together to shed light on the prevalence, consequences, and prevention of human trafficking, and ultimately to educate the public, advocate for victims, and promote efforts to combat this heinous crime. For the past, I don't know if it's 5 or 6 years, I've served on the board for Lotus Legal Clinic, which is Wisconsin's only legal clinic that provides free, direct legal services exclusively to victims of sexual violence and human trafficking, which include labor and sex trafficking. Lotus serves survivors of every sex, gender, identity, sexual orientation, nationality, race, ability, socioeconomic status, or residence status. So I gave us a nice little tee up to our topic today, and I want to get to our guest, who I think is such a lovely person and, again, so well-versed in this subject. So Erika, tell us a little bit about how you came to learn of Lotus and eventually became the ED.
Sure. Before I was at Lotus, I was a staff attorney at Legal Action of Wisconsin, and through my work there, I met the founder and first executive director, CEO of Lotus, which was Rachel Monaco Wilcox. And I had spent some time with her. She did some trainings on trauma-informed lawyering through her work at Mount Mary College. And so I met her, kind of learned of her work that she was starting to do on behalf of survivors of human trafficking within her job at Mount Mary. And aside, I guess at the same time as that, when I was at Legal Action, I worked in the housing unit and would meet individuals that were definitely at that time being exploited. And in the work that I was doing, it was intersecting with housing and housing stability and working with survivors at that time who were getting pressured because they weren't following the rules in public housing, and recognizing that the reason why they weren't is because they had this other person who was forcing them or coercing them to break some of the rules that public housing has, like who's in your household and all of the other kind of requirements that come with living in public housing. And so that was my first kind of in my career when I started to support survivors in that capacity. And so when Lotus became a nonprofit in 2016, Rachel had an open position for a clinic coordinator. And so I decided at that time that I wanted to work more closely with survivors of human trafficking, but also with an organization that was going to be able to spend some time and resources really focused on what are the vulnerabilities to trafficking and working alongside survivors. And so I applied for that job. And so I've been with Lotus since that time, and my job has overall changed through those years. I was a staff attorney, before I became the executive director, and helped kind of create what our legal program would be at Lotus and some of the legal areas of practice that we decided we had the capacity to do in-house. And so being able to shape what that looked like and get resources to do that type of work. And I've been very fortunate to learn so much from survivors and other attorneys. And also I have been really, really fortunate, I think, to now at this time be able to have a leadership position at Lotus and really look forward to the future of where Lotus is going to go.
It was legal aid or legal action?
Legal action.
Legal action. Was that your first role out of law school?
Pretty much. When I first graduated, I went to Marquette. When I first graduated from Marquette, I always wanted to do public interest law. Legal action wasn't hiring. And so I took a job in Madison as a worker compensation attorney. But I was only there for about 9 months. And then I took a job at Legal Action, and I was hired in their driver's license recovery program. So that was my first job at Legal Action, was working with low income people who had barriers to employment. So working on driver's license recovery and criminal background.
I don't think I knew that. I knew about your first role. I'm asking for the guests, but I didn't know it was in driver's license recovery. I used to do pro bono work in that area, which so many things I did not know in that space.
Yes.
And it's tremendous to have attorneys do that kind of work, because it's easy to kind of fall back. You get one ticket and then you get another ticket and then you can't pay for that. You're trying to drive. Now your license is suspended and now it costs a lot of money and you don't have it. And it's a cycle, which I think we see in a lot of impoverished communities. And that's why it's so important to have legal advocacy in those spaces.
Yes, agreed.
So back to human trafficking a bit. Can you provide an overview of the issue of human trafficking and its prevalence globally?
Human trafficking, I think in a nutshell, is the exploitation of human beings for some sort of gain for somebody else. And so that gain, I think, what you're getting from that exploitation is varied. Most of the time, I think you could say it's for financial gain. But one of the things one of the human trafficking experiences that gets less of a soundbite is things like domestic servitude. So when you're exploiting someone in your own home, that is not necessarily for financial gain. It's to provide cleaning and, child care, all of those kinds of things for free. And so I think in a nutshell, that is what human trafficking is that exploitation of another human being for your own gain. And I think globally, where we see this a lot is in economic infrastructures, in businesses. And so one of the things I think we hear the most about globally with trafficking is supply chains and in factories and working conditions in other countries. I would also say globally, and I think you see this when there's been huge articles written now about the Olympics and the FIFA World Cup, and how when you have these large events that happen globally and you need to build infrastructure, many times you're building infrastructure off of the backs of migrant populations who are coming from, a different country like Thailand, or I'm just throwing that out there, but other countries where recruiters are bringing people in to build basically the infrastructure for these events, and they're being exploited. They're not getting paid. They're not able to travel. We're told they're going to get one wage, and they get there and they're not getting that. And so I think on a global scale, at least what I've been exposed to, that is what I see and how I see it globally.
And now, a word from our sponsors.
Help ease the financial burden of a life-changing diagnosis with critical illness coverage. State Bar of Wisconsin members can apply just by answering 3 health questions. To learn more about this coverage issued by the Prudential Insurance Company of America, visit wisbar.memberenroll.com.
Hi, Russell Nicolay here with Nicolay Law, Accident and Injury Lawyers. If you have clients that have been injured, my office would love the opportunity to help them get compensated and get their life back on track. We handle referrals and co-counsel relationships on injury cases all across Wisconsin.
Thank you. And now back to the Bottom Up Podcast.
One of the ways that I came to Lotus was thankfully through the founder, Rachel, who was kind of soliciting more attorneys to join the board. And in my prior work in manufacturing, I had been doing some work around releasing statements to make sure that we were in compliance with some of the human trafficking laws in various countries, because this is an international manufacturer. So we had to make sure we were hitting all of these metrics to make sure there is no, throughout the supply chain, to your point, that there is not any human trafficking happening. And obviously that's in terms of labor for the most part. And it really focused on child labor and then that exploitation of migrant workers, which you see a lot in a lot of different contexts. So why do you think this persists? Like, what do you think the factors are that continue to contribute to this type of trafficking? You can answer that globally, or even if you want to take it to the United States or Wisconsin. What do you think?
I think it's very complex, and I will kind of bring it into the context of our country. But when you think about the United States, you do think globally too, because especially now with, our migrant crisis in this country, that is ripe for exploitation, because people are coming here unprotected. They're coming here without status. They're coming here super vulnerable because of the countries that they're coming from, and they're asking for protection because they're coming from places that are scary, that have governments that aren't stable. And I think that does get to why we have trafficking, because we have to look at what are the vulnerabilities to exploiting people. And I think a lot of that has to do with inequities and not being able to support human beings in the way that we should as a society. And because of that, those vulnerabilities, you kind of lend yourself to situations where you're kind of losing your agency and ability to make decisions that are informed, and you're supported with those decisions. So I think in in the context of human trafficking, looking at those vulnerabilities, and that could be, poverty is a huge one. And that is, you could look globally, you could look across our nation, and just here in Milwaukee, and how poverty can be something is a real vulnerable piece to being exploited. Is if you don't have the protections of an institution, you're not in school, you're not, you don't have a job, traffickers will kind of prey on those things. And because people are desperate to have things, to have housing, when I'm thinking about poverty too, I think about populations that are unhoused. Right. And so that is another huge vulnerability, especially with our youth who are unhoused. And so one of the ways in which I think that vulnerability to traffickers occurs is when people are just trying to survive. You're in survivor mode. And so if you come across another person who says, I can provide you housing, I can provide you food, that could be the first step to something that then you start to lose control.
I think many people are surprised to hear about the prevalence of human trafficking in Milwaukee or through Milwaukee. Can you talk a little bit about specific red flags or indicators that people should be or could be aware of just as they're walking down the street or interacting with others, that people may be in these positions or in these vulnerable states to be trafficked?
Yeah, and again, I think it is so nuanced, and this kind of gets to how it can be very difficult to even get to a law enforcement investigation of trafficking, is because it is definitely a hidden crime. And there definitely can be red flags, but those red flags are only going to be acknowledged if the individual is already engaging in society in a way where people are looking out for that person. And so, I mean, if you take a student or someone who should be in school and put it into that context, yes, like teachers and school providers, counselors can look for red flags in terms of like a kid that's missing school more often than not, or has an older boyfriend now who seems to be a lot older, has, maybe some newer clothes or has really nice purses or is coming to school really tired. Those can all be red flags, but they're only red flags if the victim is still engaging in the community in some way. It becomes even harder when the exploitation is happening in more isolated situations like domestic servitude, when it's in a home, when it's potentially out in rural areas in a farm. It's really hard to recognize it because it's basically an experience, and someone that exploitation is just not going to be written over someone's external body necessarily. Right. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges.
Talk a little bit about some of the physical, emotional, and psychological consequences that survivors often face. You interact with survivors often in your work as an ED, but probably more as an attorney. Mm-hmm. So tell us a little bit about those struggles and that overall, the impact that has, not just to individuals, but to our communities as a whole.
Sure. And I think what I'm saying today is, I just, to be clear, is from my perspective as someone that doesn't have that lived experience. Right. And I do think that that's one of the things that will push the needle the way we want to in terms of justice and healing for survivors, is making sure we're always creating space for survivors to express what is needed. Because oftentimes I will have, and I've learned a lot from survivors, where in my practice, I think I know what the survivor would need. And I don't always know that. Or I think it's something and it ends up not being. For example, maybe coming out of the exploitation, I think maybe one of the biggest issues is going to be someone's criminal record and wanting to look at that. And that's my own thinking. And then I'm meeting with someone and it could be something totally different. It could be, at this point, I just need housing and I just want to work on family reunification. I want to start thinking about how do I start increasing my visitation to my children who I have not seen because I have been exploited for the last, 2, 3, 5 years. And so to your question, I think that there are a lot of different ramifications and different needs that survivors need when they leave their exploitation. And I think one of the things we can do as people that care and people that are working with survivors is just really try to take the time to figure out what is most important. And I think there are cultural experiences and expressions of that too, especially when we think about healing. Healing is going to look so different depending on your personal experiences. And I think that the healing portion is so very important, and some things that I think that we overlook when we're working with survivors or trying to figure out what survivors need, because it's the survivors that know. And what we see at Lotus as some of the more critical areas of need are definitely legal services, especially if the person is not here or doesn't have status here. So we work with a lot of foreign national survivors. So immigration protections are going to be number one. And then just because that does, immigration work and process is very long, but there are some things that can happen quite quickly when the person's been identified as a victim of human trafficking. So I would say that will help kind of stabilize individuals. Once you're beyond the crisis moment and you have someone housed and they're safe from their trafficker, it's issues of whether or not the person wants to report to law enforcement. That's always going to be a question. And if they don't, how else are we supporting the person when they don't want to report to law enforcement? So criminal records are definitely an area that we see a lot of need in. The other thing I think that does not get a lot of discussion around in terms of the legal needs of survivors after exploitation is the immense amount of damage to someone's credit that can happen. One of the things, and this is going to be more specific with like domestic sex trafficking, where you have traffickers who use their victims' credit to their advantage. For instance, a trafficker will require his or her victim to purchase or get a loan for a vehicle in the victim's name because the trafficker's credit is not great and couldn't get that. It could be that the trafficker is requiring, if the individual has public benefits, requiring that the victim turn over all of their checks to the trafficker. And so that can cause problems with the administration of that. If it's Social Security, you can get into, there could be issues with that down the road when you're exiting. And so one of the things we do see, and credit card is another one where traffickers will require victims to either purchase things with a credit card. Unfortunately, I think another way that the credit card issue comes up is when the trafficker is looking for places to, especially in sex trafficking cases, for hotel rooms or something like that, that usually those records of those hotel like rentals are not in the trafficker's name. Because traffickers are smart and they're not going to create a record to find their names like in a hotel ledger or something like that. So that is another, I think we're not talking about it enough as the legal community, but survivors are. Right. Like they're like, my credit is totally messed up. I can't get anything right now. And there are laws that are very useful and specific to trafficking survivors now on a federal level that could really help survivors of trafficking.
And now, a word from our sponsors.
Created by Wisconsin lawyers in 1986 to protect the financial future of lawyers like themselves and the clients they serve, Wilmick continues to demonstrate a leading commitment to Wisconsin's legal community. No company is more trustworthy than Wilmick when you're facing a legal malpractice claim. Put your trust in your premium with an insurance company that supports Wisconsin legal associations and events. Wilmick, insuring and supporting the legal community since 1986.
Attention legal professionals, legal disputes can often be intense and personal safety is paramount. Introducing Reduce Your Risk, a guide to personal safety and security for the legal community. Empower yourself with the expert insights to minimize risks at the office, courthouse, home, and online. Create an actionable safety plan, align ethics with safety and enhance well-being. Stay ahead of potential threats. Get your copy today at wispar.org. Empower your practice, ensure your safety, reduce your risk. Thank you. And now back to the Bottom Up Podcast.
You started talking a little bit about healing. Once survivors are safe, they want to get to a path of healing, or they begin this path of healing. And I know Lotus focuses a lot on, part of our mission and our vision is to honor the rights of survivors and making sure their voices are always uplifted, and they have these pathways to justice and to healing. So can you talk a little bit about some of the projects that Lotus is involved in that space?
Sure. I really like talking about this part of Lotus because I do think it makes Lotus unique in the sense of a legal clinic, but also having these opportunities for survivors to create community we have writing workshops where survivors can process their trauma through creative writing outlets. And I think during those writing workshops, what happens is they create a sense of their own community in those moments, in those times when they're writing and they're sharing. And I think it's cathartic. Again, I'm speaking not as a survivor, but of what the feedback that we do get. And just me, like even being in the room sometimes and seeing organically that empathy for each other is very powerful to witness. And also kind of witness the resiliency of survivors and how strong that human beings can be. And I think with some of the other healing options or opportunities that we have at Lotus, along with the writing workshops, is we do offer in partnership with that art therapy, so that when survivors are doing these kind of intense writing workshops and exercises, that there's also this other component of being able to express in a different way. And I think that's important to raise, because at Lotus, we experience survivors, not just, they're coming from so many different variable backgrounds, different cultural expressions of healing. And I think that's an exciting thing about Lotus and its future, is being able to offer these opportunities for healing in cultural ways that are going to be beneficial to the survivors. And I don't know the answer to that. And that's, but it's like opening up that space to explore what that might mean. Another example with survivors that we do is we have an artist in residency. And so this year we brought in a musician who is working with five survivor writers who have gone through our Untold Stories. So they are already have poems that they have written, and they will be working with this musician to kind of move from their poetry to lyrics to a song. And once those songs are, and the artist will be working with the survivors to create that, and we'll create an album, and then there'll be a celebration of that, and we'll have a concert where the survivors themselves, I think, will have the opportunity, if they want to, talk about that experience at this event, but also read their poems and then hear the song that the artist has created from their poetry. And so that's, I think, kind of those pathways of healing that occur. And then I think Lotus is also creating space for survivors who really want to engage in other ways of seeking justice than our traditional legal system. And what I mean by that is kind of working with survivors who might want to engage in advocacy work, where they have either had a bad experience through the criminal legal system or civil legal system, and want to really work on how do we make our laws better. And that could be post reporting and victimization. So what it means to be a victim in a case, or trying to pursue civil claims against their trafficker, or it could be things that occurred prior to their victimization and really are drivers to what made them vulnerable, which could be, for example, increased mental health and therapeutic outlets for young people that have been sexually abused as children, because that is one of a very high indicator for sex trafficking survivors, is that in the past, part of their experience leading up to that has been some sort of child abuse. And so I think when you give agency to survivors and give space to say, how do we solve this? How do we solve this? It's survivors that have a lot of intel to give to say, like, if I had this, I might not have been exploited. And like, survivors are the ones that can tell us what was missing.
Right.
So
thank you for sharing that, Erika. That is also probably one of my favorite things about Lotus, is how we meld the healing with the art therapy and the creativity, or its scholarships to help people get into careers or to start a new job or get a certificate. It makes us unique, and the passion around the staff that each of you have, for you to Heather to Austin, everyone involved. I know I'm leaving people out, but everyone has, that passion is there for the people you speak to every day. So I really appreciate that. I admire you a lot, and just the work that you do, because it's tough work. And this is a vulnerable community that we care a lot about. So I want to talk a little bit about, you mentioned how sometimes survivors have these negative experiences with the criminal justice system. What are some of the challenges or barriers that hinder or can hinder effective prosecution of human trafficking cases?
I think one of the biggest, there's two, I think, when I think about this question. One is that is just a human issue, which is, it is very difficult to start investigations of trafficking when the investigation is going to be centered on a victim reporting. Because if that's the approach, victims don't report being trafficked, because it's victims don't see themselves as victims, right? So it's like, people are just surviving. They don't, this is their reality. And so it's very, I think, very, very difficult to get a disclosure of what a person is experiencing and being exploited in that moment, because for many people in the moment, I am just trying to survive. Like, this is someone that I know is not good for me, but I'm just surviving. Or it's someone I care about. I mean, one of the things that really makes this a very complex for law enforcement, that makes it even more complex, is the trauma bonding that can happen between a trafficker and their victim. It's almost really, it does in some ways mirror DV relationships, where you're just in it, and you've created this support system that's very toxic, but it's in the moments you can't see a way out of it, and it's your identity at that time. And traffickers do a lot of work, just like other abusers do, saying, if you call the police, no one's going to believe you. You've committed these crimes. You're a drug addict, and so no one's going to believe you, or you're going to be arrested. So I think that makes it so difficult. And I think when I was talking about prior about the isolation and how it's hard to physically see exploitation, I think that impacts whether or not, like, where investigations go. Also, I would say that for prosecutions and investigations of human trafficking, you need resources. In my experience, because I'm not a prosecutor or law enforcement, a lot of investigations around human trafficking, they take a really long time. And lots of times you lose your victims because it just takes too long, and people are in vulnerable situations and they're not stable. And so it's very difficult when you center the entire investigation around someone's disclosure. It's just hard because it's a complex investigation. The other point I wanted to make about this challenge is, especially, I think it's not just sex trafficking, it's labor trafficking too. People are vulnerable to law enforcement interactions. Just on its face, survivors or victims of sex trafficking who are forced to engage in commercial sexual activity, that is a crime. And so you're always going to be subject to police questioning. And even in labor trafficking, if you are a vulnerable immigrant, you're not going to feel comfortable unless you have other supports, unless you have education about your rights. You're not going to feel comfortable engaging with law enforcement because you're scared of law enforcement. And traffickers know that, and they use that. What we see at Lotus too is survivors who are criminalized. You see that all the time. If you have already been arrested 2-3 times in your life, how do you build that trust with law enforcement when they actually do want to help? But in your own mind, you're like, well, the last 3 times this has happened, like, I've been arrested and, I have criminal charges pending. That is another kind of layer to that.
So what can we do? And when I say we, I mean as attorneys, as anyone who's listening to this. Some of it can be, I guess, contributing to the prevention of human trafficking, and other do we need more lobbyists? How can we not only make this easier for survivors to go through the system? I'm not calling on you to solve all the world's problems, Erika.
Thank you, Kristen. I really appreciate that.
Like, the more I'm crafting this question, and I'm like, I just really mean, like, what? Because I know some people are going to listen to this and think, oh man, I didn't understand how large this problem was, and it feels arduous. Like, how can I actually do something? So what are just some of your thoughts, Erika, of what we can do?
That's a good question. And I will say, when I first started working at Lotus, I felt like it was like I couldn't say the right things. Like, when I was asked to talk about my job and what I did, I felt like I was stumbling over my words and couldn't really express what I wanted to say, and I think the reason is because it is so complex, right? And that every survivor is different, and they have a different trajectory, life experience. And so I think one of the things I think I could speak first to our legal community is being able to share your skill set on an organization that's working on behalf of survivors and with survivors, be that you're on their board, like you, Kristen, thank you. Mm-hmm. Because every nonprofit needs a strong board, and lawyers can fill that and do that type of work. Another way is supporting those organizations and being able to show up for them and any way that you can. And that could be like making donations to organizations that you trust, but it could also be seeking out opportunities for pro bono work. And I think that there are legal practice areas that are specific to working with human trafficking survivors that could, that a private attorney that wanted to give back could in those instances. There are, Lotus has some opportunities for that, but so does legal action. And so that's another way for the legal community. And I'm going to speak very specifically to the criminal legal community, because there is a lot of opportunity for movement in that area. And I think there is some currently happening. But when I raised earlier kind of this victim defendant duality, there is space to bring in the defense bar more with the prosecutors to kind of work on how do we help survivors when they have both of those experiences of being criminalized, but then yet being a victim in a case. So.
And now, a word from our sponsors. Are you struggling with work-life balance issues? Could you use some help addressing these challenges? WISLAP offers confidential well-being support to lawyers, judges, and law students. With trained peer volunteers, structured well-being resources, and individualized support services, WISLAP aims to foster work-life balance within the Wisconsin legal community. Find us on the web at wispar.org/WISLAP. What? You don't have an Ultimate Pass yet? Oh, that's a mistake. Find out why at wispar.org/ultimatepass.
Those are all important. Just to put a fine point on, you talked about the support that organizations, be it a legal aid or legal action or Lotus, they need. If I'm not mistaken, Lotus operates solely on grants, right?
Correct. Yes.
So that's a really easy way. Learn more about human trafficking. Talk to the people. Erika's always willing to talk to people. Yes. Or it's someone on the board, anyone who's just can give you more information, and then donate your time or your resources or whatever it is that you can give to organizations that are doing all of this good work. That's the way that I get involved. It is not my area of practice, but I know a lot more about human trafficking now than I did 6 years ago. And I'm always a big advocate for Lotus and organizations like Lotus, because without them, it would be harder for so many people out here. So I appreciate that. I just want to put a fine point on it about donating time and resources, because organizations like Lotus need it. So tell me a little bit about the ways that technology and social media and the internet, I guess generally, can be both a tool for traffickers, but then also a means to raise awareness and actually combat human trafficking.
Yeah, as you state, social media, and specifically like Facebook or things like that, can be a platform for recruiting, not necessarily recruiting victims, but there are definitely cases of that for sure, where people pretend like they're interested in someone, but I think it's used more to post ads for people to engage in commercial sex activities. And so I think that is a huge tool that unfortunately is used to perpetuate a crime. And so this gets really into the weeds, but there have been some laws that have been passed that were meant to kind of combat that, but actually have had some negative impact. And I guess part of why that is because social media is also used to create community and to create closed spaces of communication between people. And so social media is also used for individuals that are engaging in the sex trades, be it through exploitation or not, where they can talk about who are the bad dates, where are the bad people coming from, who do we stay away from, what neighborhoods do we not go into. Those have been those communications that actually protect people. Those are gone away. And so when you do that, that has been something I think people didn't think about, but it has made people less safe. I think that's the tricky part of it. The internet and social media, though, to your point of like other positives things, is that it can spread awareness. A lot of us that engage in this work, we are a part of, kind of national organizations that come together with a shared mission or shared agenda items to tackle trafficking and to make things better and to improve on our laws and access to justice for survivors. And I think we use social media for that. There are so many misconceptions about human trafficking and what it looks like, and so many myths. And the only way that you can really get the story out that these are myths, like anyone can be trafficked, you're going to get snatched off the street type things, which some of, that is not accurate, is using our platforms to keep inundating with facts. And when I'm saying facts, lots of that is just based on agencies and individuals who have lived experiences. And we have got to start listening to people who have those experiences, and our social media platforms are great for that. So
you talked a little bit about, or you're starting to talk about those misconceptions or those myths. Can you tease that out a little bit more? Sure. Like, what are some of those misconceptions in the human trafficking space from your vantage point that you often hear or you're often faced with, or you find yourself responding to? And then how can we do a better job of debunking those myths?
So I think some of the larger myths center around like every child is unsafe, and that, a truck comes by and can just snatch a kid from the street. I think there's less of that now, but it's still this idea that victims need rescuing, like we're going to rescue people. That's a big myth, because most times it's the survivors figuring out how to get out of that situation. Right. It's not because, a man in shining armor comes and rescues them. That's a big myth. Other larger myths just kind of center around a lot of it, just like human trafficking is sex trafficking. Right. It gets conflated to that all the time. Organizations that really say, no, this isn't the only way that people are exploited, and being able to share instances of how that's the different. And so you're talking about domestic servitude, or you're talking about labor trafficking that occurs in Wisconsin on our agricultural farms. And what does that look like? A lot of people think that trafficking still has to move between jurisdictions in some ways too. And so that can be a big myth as well. The way that we debunk the myths is that we support and we listen to organizations that are working closely with survivors, if not through survivor leadership or leaders themselves, but just like really digging deep into the complexities of it. Some of what we hear makes it seem like it's really easy to save someone from trafficking. It's not, and it's very complex. We can't just rescue our way out of this. Survivors have so many needs post exploitation, and so many ways that I think survivors could heal and mend and move on with their lives. And that's where we have to spend our time and our energy. So, because one of the things that happens is if we don't create that support for survivors post exploitation, there's just going to be re-victimization.
Right. I think one of the biggest misconceptions for me is that once upon a time, that it was only sex trafficking. And then the next, when I learned more about labor trafficking, was that only happened in rural places. I watched an independent documentary years ago, and this was in an urban area. It may have been, or a metro. Maybe it was Newark, New Jersey. And it was about labor trafficking, women who had been brought over from another country, and they were doing hair. They were doing hair. Mm-hmm. And they had been brought over under false pretenses. I think the way that they had positioned it was, your children, your teenagers can go to school and they'll be able to do all these things, all this opportunity in America. Great. And then they got here, they took their passports, and they had them working in a shop. They were not being paid, they were being fed, and they were being housed, but they had no control over anything else. And they didn't even realize that they were in this situation until many years later when this person, I don't know how they exactly came to realize it, but that was so, I don't know, that's something that I could have run into myself, right? Yeah. I could have been in one of those shops, getting a service and not realizing that these people have been brought here under false pretenses and they don't have a way home, and they don't even know that this is, you made that point earlier about it, how it's a, you didn't call it a quiet crime, but a hidden crime, a masked crime, often because the victims don't know that they're victims. And they eventually know, but they didn't at the time. And that was just that was something that for me had to be debunked, that this is not just, when we're talking about labor trafficking, it's not just rural areas. We're not talking about farming. It happens right here around us all the time.
Yeah. Another area that we're just starting to talk about and recognize is, especially in urban areas, forced criminalization. I mean, that is another form of labor trafficking. And I think we see this in gang environments and gang recruiting. And even when and I have no background for this, don't quote me on this at all, but even the reckless driving that we're seeing in Milwaukee, it's some of that, when you look and break that down, where is the agency with some of those kids? Are they being forced to do this for somebody else? Yes. And so it's, that is another very complex issue. Right. But if you look at it in the context of, did the person have agency to commit this crime? Right. And so forced criminality is another expression, that is another crime of labor trafficking. So what's a message or a call to action you'd like to convey to our listeners regarding human trafficking awareness, just to wrap us up? How can people get involved and make a difference in the fight against human trafficking? I think support organizations like Lotus would be great. Yes. But I also think that engage in your communities. We have to start looking at, and we do, it's not we have to start, people are recognizing the vulnerabilities to trafficking. But if it is, engaging in our communities to figure out what is missing, how can we support people with jobs, with young people, with how are we getting them to be involved in activities and building their confidence so that they're not out there susceptible to a human being that is offering them love and attention and food and things that they want? How do we provide support to people and to our communities of people before that happens? So I would say that is one way, is engaging in our communities, supporting organizations that are working with individuals that need help. And then I would also say another thing to do, call to action, would be to listen to survivors when you have the opportunity, because survivors can tell us what they needed before. What is it that could have helped so that they weren't going to be exploited, or at least less likely to be exploited? And then post-conviction, listening to survivors to say, this is what I need. Trafficking, one of the main things that I think happens to individuals, that you lose all sense of autonomy. You're no longer thinking for yourself or can think for yourself. You can't make decisions on your own. And so one of the things that is most powerful in terms of that journey of healing and justice is being able to give survivors that space to seek their own autonomy and decision making again. Erika, I want to thank you for joining us. Thank you again for all of your work. You and all the staff at Lotus are such lovely people and so easy to work with. I really mean that in this work, and you're passionate about this work.
And these are exactly the kind of people that we need to raise up and give their flowers to in this profession. So I want to thank you not only for joining us, but for all of your work and for being our ED. I helped hire Erika, and she's won many awards and is very popular and could have gone a lot of other places and done other things, but she accepted this role and has been excelling at it consistently year to year. And we've seen a lot of growth from the organization since she's joined in this elevated role. So thank you, Erika. What's the website, the Lotus website, for everyone to check out?
It's www.lotuslegal.org.
Thank you. 'Cause sometimes when you Google Lotus, you get
a lot of
other
weird stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah. Flowers.
So, exactly. Let's get the right thing. Thanks, Erika.
Thank you, Kristen. I really appreciate it.
Of course.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. If you have a topic you'd like us to explore, let us know. I'm your host, Emilio Villagale, and we'll catch you next time.